Hello there, and welcome back to the channel. Mad Mike here, and today we're going to continue our journey to Endgame. And today we are going to be looking at Iron Man 2, which came out in 2010. Now, Iron Man 2 is the continuation of Iron Man and the Tony Stark character. We have most of the returning actors. You have Robert Downey Jr. returning as Tony Stark. You have Gwyneth Paltrow returning as Pepper Potts. Jon Favreau directing again, and also returning as Happy Hogan. You have a notable change up with the Colonel Rhodes character. Terrence Howard, due to some financial disagreements with Marvel Studios, dropped out of the sequel, and he was then replaced by Don Cheadle, who has played the role ever since and is continuing to play him and will play him again in Endgame. And then we also introduce our main villain characters, which is it's a split really between Justin Hammer, who is played by Sam Rockwell, and Ivan Vanko, who is played by Mickey Rourke. This is kind of Mickey Rourke's comeback period. He had done The Wrestler, I believe, a year before that, and he had done a few other films. But this was kind of as part of his comeback career. He was a big name at the time, which I think was the reason why they hired him on. He's really not a very good villain, and I'll kind of get to that. I do have some issues with this movie, even though I don't out and out hate it. There are some problems with it. But we do start out the movie, instead of introducing Tony Stark, which again, I think it's good when you do a sequel. You need to reintroduce the audience to the character, obviously, which good movies usually do. But in this scenario, we kind of already knew a lot about Tony Stark from the first Iron Man, and they take that opening scene to introduce you to Ivan Vanko, who in the comics is actually the second Crimson Dynamo, and his father Anton Vanko was the original one. It's really weird, but they make him Whiplash for some reason, who's another Iron Man villain character. I don't know what the choice was for that or why they specifically did it, other than maybe to have that USSR connection. But in the opening scene, we see that Mickey Rourke is crying over his father's death. His father being Anton Vanko, who dies, and then he begins construction of what we believe it would become an arc reactor, similar to what Tony Stark built for his Iron Man suits. And apparently Anton Vanko had the designs for it, and that's explained a little later on. That Anton Vanko and Howard Stark were apparently business partners, and the business went sour, and Anton Vanko wound up going back to Soviet Russia, and he couldn't recreate what Howard Stark had done. So he was basically put in a gulag for most of his life, or I think maybe it might have been in Siberia or something like that. He was thrown in prison. But after that, we go back to Tony Stark, and we get reintroduced to him in a big way, which is that's stereotypical for Tony Stark. It's not as good as the introduction, I would say, in the first Iron Man, but it's still kind of interesting, where it shows him, all right, he dives out of a plane in the Iron Man armor, and he does the whole thing. And at the end, we get introduced to the Stark Expo, which is basically it's a year-round science and technology event that gets basically so inventors can show off their new inventions. It's kind of like a World's Fair, essentially. That's really what it is. And this kind of muddies things up a little bit for me, because they kind of show you in later films, and they do show you a little bit in this one too, that Howard Stark was not the best father. And to be honest, Tony Stark probably was not the best son. But Tony Stark it kind of shows that he has a begrudging respect for his father in this, more than an actual dislike for him. But the dynamic between Tony and Howard, even though they obviously they don't really show them. I think they only show them on screen once in Captain America: Civil War, and that's in kind of like a flashback type of thing. But it really they don't. It's more just how they interact in terms of the past. It's very strange. But so we move forward from the Stark Expo, and we find out that essentially. And this goes back to certain other things, but we find out that Tony Stark is essentially the element known as palladium, which is what keeps his arc reactor going is also slowly killing him. And they show like these lines and stuff on his chest. But this kind of goes back to another thing where I don't know why we're kind of going over this again. Like, I get that it's a main plot point during the film for Tony Stark to kind of be facing his own mortality, but he's essentially he's done that already. You know, he already did it in the first Iron Man when he's in the cave, and they said that, you know, you'll probably be dead in a week, and then he overcomes that and he survives. But they've already shown him uh, facing his own death or facing his mortality, actually twice, because at the end of the film, he tells Pepper to, you know, press the button with the arc reactor, and he thinks it's going to kill him, but he lucks out and it doesn't. But we've already seen him do this twice, so I don't understand why they need to drag it out for a whole film, other than to kind of make Tony Stark a bit of an erratic character. Um, and that keeps going and going and going. The other thing that we do introduce in this film is Scarlett Johansson comes in as Natasha Romanoff, otherwise known as Black Widow, who she would return as in many, many, many other movies after that, and who is getting her own solo film. I believe it starts filming in June of this year. But she does a really good job kind of playing that, I want to say, femme fatale type. Tony Stark, obviously being kind of the womanizer that he is immediately drawn to her. We have an early scene where Tony Stark is kind of like teaching himself how to fight, which is, honestly, that's an interesting scene, just because Tony Stark is, in the first Iron Man, he really doesn't know a lot about self-defense. He just knows that he's in this Iron Man suit and he can, you know, punch and hit people and do a bunch of stuff. But he doesn't really have, his movements are not that graceful. He's very clunky when he's in the suit, no pun intended. But in this movie, you see that he's starting to hone his ability to fight, and that's really something that carries into both this film, especially in the final act, and in films later. And honestly, that's a good way to build up the character, even though it's a little scene and it's kind of subtle. Now, the other main part of this is with the Justin Hammer character, who's played by Sam Rockwell. And basically, the U.S. government is trying to force Tony Stark to give up the Iron Man armor because they believe that it is a weapon and that it is hazardous to allow him to keep it. And Tony Stark is essentially claiming that it is a prosthesis suit. It is not a weapon. It is not designed to be a weapon. And really, he's arguing technical stuff, more or less, because, you know, if you look at any of the Iron Man movies, it really is pretty much a weapon. But he has basically he's basically trying to fight the government on this, and he doesn't want them to take the suit. Now, Justin Hammer, on the other hand, runs Hammer Industries, which is a private sort of it's the same as Stark Industries. They're a weapons designer, and he is trying to make his own suit. And Tony Stark just basically humiliates Justin Hammer throughout the entire movie. Honestly, Sam Rockwell playing this character is really, really annoying. He is not really a very he's not he tries to be like that charismatic kind of calm villain, almost kind of like a Lex Luthor. He doesn't really act out in anger that much. He just kind of tries to be suave, but he's not really intimidating because he kind of looks a little weaselly. He's not really intimidating at all, and it does hurt the movie because he doesn't fill you with any kind of dread, even though he's really the kind of the guy behind everything pulling the strings. And it's a major villain problem with this movie because Ivan Vanko doesn't really fill up that villain pool either. Even though you have two villains, they really don't mesh together very well. It should be, you know, hypothetically, it should be, you know, the brains in Justin Hammer and the brawn in Ivan Vanko, but it really doesn't work that way very well. And like I said before, you know, they do the introduction in the courtroom when Tony Stark's arguing his point, where Don Cheadle comes in as the new Colonel Rhodes, and you get to debut that character. But you know, we move forward. I'm kind of going to skip over a few minor things here and go to the race in Monte Carlo. Now, at this point, Tony Stark, he's realizing that he can't find a replacement element for the palladium that's killing him, which means he has no way out, that he is going to die one way or another. Either the shrapnel is going to make its way into his heart and he's going to die that way, or the palladium poisoning his blood will kill him. And he's kind of fighting with this idea of how he tells Pepper Potts about this, because it's obvious at this point that there's romantic tension between the two of them. He gives her control of his company. Um, and he really, he gave her control of his company at the end of the previous film, but he really just, or sorry, at the end of this film, I should say. But what he really does is that he's try it's less him rationalizing. He's almost accepted the fact that he's going to die at this point. He doesn't really care. He just cares more about how it's going to affect the people around him and what's happening with the situations with the villains. But because of that kind of pressure on him, he starts acting erratically. And one of those things is he decides to get in a race car, in his own car that's running in the Monte Carlo Indy race, and race, and that's when we first meet Ivan Vanko. Now, this does not make a whole lot of sense to me. This entire action scene. Now, some of it is all right. The last part of it is actually really good, but it doesn't draw out that much. And the problems with it are, Ivan Vanko shows up on the racetrack. He starts cutting up all these cars and stuff. Looks awesome. The CGI in this movie, I will say that, is really good. But Ivan Vanko then goes after Tony Stark's car. He crashes his car, so Happy Hogan and Pepper Potts drive out onto the racetrack to give him his armor, which is like a suitcase armor. It's meant to be a homage to the Silver Centurion armor from the comic books. And they drive out, and he tries to give him the armor, but there's like this really like almost slapstick comedy thing. But the only problem I have here is Happy Hogan hits Ivan Vanko with the car that he's in, and pins him against a barricade. Now, as far as we can tell, I don't think Ivan Vanko has any armor below the waist. He just has the harness or whatever and the arc reactor to use the energy whips that he has. So how the hell aren't his legs just complete mush? Like his bottom half should have exploded. He should have been cut in half because he smashes him into that barricade a couple of times. But barring that, let's say hypothetically there was armor. Ivan Vanko starts cutting the car up and stuff like that. And Tony Stark, the whole time Tony Stark is trying to get the suitcase with the armor and he can't get it. It's slapstick and it's kind of stupid. The moment that he does get the armor, though, the actual transformation where it shows the armor like form over him and all that stuff, and it's kind of a call. It's kind of a precursor to the Blood's Edge armor that he uses in Infinity War. But he gets into the suit, and then you have a very, very, very short altercation with Ivan Vanko, where Iron Man basically just overpowers him and rips out his arc reactor. Now, the actual armor transformation scene is great, but the scene in which he is fighting Ivan Vanko, who is now he's Whiplash. The villain's name is Whiplash, even though they never say that in the film. And basically what winds up happening is that Ivan Vanko was arrested. And Tony Stark basically, oh, look at the hero. But see, this is another weird part, is that there's a line that Ivan Vanko says to Tony Stark, if you can make God bleed, people will cease to believe in him. And or people will stop believing in him. Tony Stark won the fight. Like, I don't know what the hell he's talking about. Like, Tony Stark got the shit beat out of him by Ironmonger in the last movie. Like, he bled quite a bit. But, for some reason, Ivan Vanko seems to think that because he's fought Tony Stark and he's managed to like hurt him, when he's out of his Iron Man armor, then that means that he's like destroyed his image. So again, it seems it's very short-sighted and weird. But that's the dialogue choices. Which I put up more on the writer than the director, although the director probably should have tweaked that a little bit, or tweaked the fight scene, so it seemed like it was a bit more even matched. But you go back now, and we see that basically this is kind of driven Tony now to a new level of having pressure on him, because now you've added not only the pressure of his own mortality, but the pressure of this sort of this new supervillain that's shown up, that apparently also has an arc reactor. And they have there's a little meeting between Tony Stark and Ivan Vanko where they discuss things, and Vanko explains, everything about his father and Tony's father and all that. And then Tony goes back to his house, and it's his birthday. And this is actually kind of a fun line where he has a little conversation with Scarlett Johansson, and he basically says that he asked her, what would you do if you knew it was your last birthday ever? And she said, I'd party it up. Essentially, I'd make it the best birthday ever. And so Tony Stark, and this is the cringiest stuff in this entire movie. This entire segment is just complete trash, and I wish they had done it a different way. It could have very easily been done a different way. And Tony Stark gets drunk and gets into the Iron Man suit, and then proceeds to start he basically starts skeet shooting stuff with repulsor beams in his house, which is insane. Somebody throws like a watermelon up and he blows it up, and at the same time, Don Cheadle is there with Gwyneth Paltrow, and they're trying to like get him to stop and get everybody to leave so they can get him out of the suit and stuff. And Tony's having none of it. He's on a microphone. He's trying to DM everything. I think he accidentally blows up the bar, and Don Cheadle decides to go downstairs and get his Tony Stark's Mark II armor, which is the silver one from the first movie. And they then everybody clear. Don Cheadle has everybody clear out of the house, and then him and Tony Stark have a throwdown. Now, if you wanted to have Tony Stark and Don Cheadle have a throwdown, that's fine. That's awesome. But don't have it be during this weird, cringy party where Tony Stark is getting shit-faced in the Iron Man suit. And then it ends with this like weird. I don't know why a repulsor beams like meeting would do this, but they fire the repulsor beams and it causes this like explosion that destroys the whole inside of the building. And then Don Cheadle just says screw it, and he brings the silver Iron Man suit to the military so that they can reverse engineer it. And he doesn't care if Tony wants him to take it or not, because he doesn't think that Tony is deserving of the suit. And again, at this point, Tony has not told anybody that he is dying of palladium poisoning. But this is now the point where we kind of reach what I would call the turning point in the film, because everything after this is pretty good leading up to the final battle. All the early stuff is the cringe and the weird stuff and the stuff that doesn't really fit tonally. Now we get to the point where we're getting all good. So Justin Hammer breaks Ivan Vanko out of jail and brings him to his facility, because he wants to make Iron Man suits and he wants Ivan to do it for him, because he saw what he had done on television to Tony Stark. So he agrees, and we check in at a few points during the movie with him. But basically, it goes from making an Iron Man suit to then he's making drones. And then they program the drones, and basically Justin Hammer's whole thing is he wants to show up Tony Stark at the Stark Expo with these new drones that are designed for the four branches of the military. And that then leads to a whole slew of other things, because Ivan Vanko has his own goals in mind. But at the same time, what's going on with Tony Stark is Nick Fury shows up, because the next day Tony Stark is in his Iron Man suit eating donuts for some weird reason. I don't know why he's in the Iron Man suit, other than the fact that he just decided to take it out and go eat donuts and drink coffee because he's hungover. But meets him at a donut shop, and basically Nick Fury says that he's a mess. Of course, Nick Fury's been keeping tabs on him, so he knows everything that's been happening in Tony's life. But this is kind of a good scene where we really introduce Sam Jackson into these films. And again, you have to take into consideration that even though Captain Marvel comes chronologically before this, it was made this year. So 2010 is really the first taste we get of Nick Fury in any kind of a major role, other than showing up. He shows up at the end of the first Iron Man film, and that's really all that we see of him until Iron Man 2. But then he has this discussion with him at the table about how he's screwed up and how he needs to knuckle down. And Tony Stark is really doesn't care. But Nick Fury essentially just essentially locks him in his house and says, "You're gonna fix whatever the hell's going on with you, because we have an insane supervillain that's on the loose, and we got a bunch of other crap that's going on. So you gotta shape up." And through this, Tony Stark learns a bunch of stuff. He goes back to the house. Clark Gregg's Agent Coulson is basically there to babysit him and make sure he doesn't leave the house unless he has to. And there's a bunch of this stuff where Tony Stark goes through this whole thing where he looks back at all these old videos about his dad and trying to figure stuff out, and he doesn't understand what's going on. And again, this is kind of the reason why I don't really get why later on he still has issues with his dad, because he kind of finds out through all this research that his dad was kind of like, his dad just expected more of him because he was a Stark and because he was so smart, and he expected him to kind of take over the Empire. And they show these old movies and stuff like that, and through that, Tony Stark is actually able to surmise that. And this is a dumb plot point. I will say this. This is a dumb plot point. This is almost like a writer's back door for what happens in the film. Is that Tony Stark finds out that the layout for the old original Stark Expo is actually a molecular diagram for a new element that just happens to be an element that would keep him from keep his arc reactor from killing him. Uh, and again, there's a lot of dominoes that have to fall in order for that to even make sense, and it doesn't really work. But regardless of that, Tony Stark creates this new element, and he creates this new arc reactor that then essentially, heals him, and they change up the chest plate, kind of like some of the comic book versions where it's a triangle instead of a circle. But it's very clunkily done. It's not that great. But then we get into the final confrontation, which I personally like, except for the showdown that he has with Ivan Vanko at the end. And we basically show that when Colonel Rhodes brings the iron suit to the military, they bring in Justin Hammer. Justin Hammer outfits the thing with a whole bunch of weapons, and then they have their presentation at the Stark Expo. Now, Tony Stark then realizes that something's going down at the Stark Expo, and he has to go there and basically save everybody, because if he doesn't, then they're going to have some issues. And it's mostly because the SHIELD agents break into Hammer Industries and find that Ivan Vanko has escaped and that there is something going on. So they have to get to the Stark Expo. And the final set piece is where Tony Stark and War Machine, or who is known as War Machine now, the Don Cheadle souped up suit of armor. Basically, what happens is there's a program that Ivan Vanko wrote into all the robots that then caused them to go insane and start, blowing everything up. And same thing with Colonel Rhodes' suit, the War Machine suit. That's under control too, but they managed to get him out of it somehow, but they can't stop the drones. So Iron Man and War Machine then proceed to take out all the drones, and the scenes actually are really good. They're well choreographed. The stuff with the suits is really cool. I wish there had been a bit more of that. Most of it's just this long chase scene in and around where the Stark Expo is. But I digress. The point is that they do all that, and then there's one more left. They find out, there's one more. He's coming in, and it turns out it's Ivan Vanko in a new Iron Man type suit that we haven't seen before, by the way. I wish we had seen something cool leading up to that, because they never show him with that suit at all. And he shows up and basically beats the living crap out of both of them. And they're pretty much getting destroyed when they both realized, all right, they have to do the same like sonic repulsor sonic boom thing they did before, and it'll destroy Ivan Vanko's suit. So they do that, and the fight ends. It's very anticlimactic in that sense. Their showdown directly with him. It is not nearly as good as the Ironmonger showdown in the first Iron Man film. Because again, it's 2 against 1, and it's very, very short. There's really not a lot to that fight. Most of it is the lead up where Iron Man and War Machine are fighting the drones, and that action is really good, especially the close hand-to-hand stuff that they do. But the stuff that happens after that with Ivan Vanko is just, it's over way too quick. It's over. It's almost as anticlimactic as Ivan Vanko's fight with him during the Monte Carlo race. But again, he's defeated, and they figure out that I guess all of the drones are rigged to blow up, and there's one that I guess is back at, and again, I can't remember exactly if this is this is the case, but Pepper Potts is over at the facility. Justin Hammer has also been arrested at this point, and he gets led away. And again, this is another thing, we never see Justin Hammer again. He never pops up in any later films. He just poof, he's gone. And but Iron Man flies off, saves Pepper Potts from being blown up by one of the drones, and they land on a rooftop, and basically that's when they kind of admit that they're in love with each other and they have a relationship and whatever, and they kiss and everything, and then Don Cheadle's just sitting there, and he's like, I've been here the whole time. You picked the wrong roof. I was here first. It's kind of this funny little banter between Don Cheadle and Robert Downey Jr. But of course, he flies away, and then we're left with Iron Man and Pepper Potts on the roof, and that's essentially how the main plot ends. But then you go into what is the post-credit scene. Or sorry, not the post-credit scene. You go into what is the last scene of the movie, which is Tony Stark in a room with Nick Fury, and there's a neat little Easter egg that's on the wall, and it's a world map on a little display screen, and they have a bunch of little blinking red dots on it. And if you look at the red dots, they're actually in strategic locations. So you can see there's actually one in Africa, which is supposed to be Wakanda. There's one in New Mexico, which is supposed to be Thor's hammer, which leads into the after credit scene. And then there's another one, I think it's supposed to be in Canada someplace, which is where Captain America, but they find him. But it's a neat little Easter egg. It kind of just points to some stuff. But Tony Stark and Nick Fury have some conversation, and basically it's all lead in for Avengers, saying that Nick Fury wants somebody else in the Iron Man suit essentially, but even though that really doesn't. Again, it's one of those things. I don't even know why they had it in there, because nobody's in the Iron Man suit besides Tony Stark. And technically Don Cheadle, but Don Cheadle isn't even in Avengers. So, moving past that, we go to the after credit scene, which is these people discovering a giant crater in New Mexico, and at the bottom of it is Thor's hammer, which leads into the first Thor film. Now, looking at everything encompassing this film, it does a good job. It does a somewhat good job at its action. Like I said, a lot of the main action set pieces are far too short, or they're hammered in with comedy that doesn't really work, or some dialogue that doesn't work. But the only thing that I think this movie really does well is it does a decent job of setting up Avengers, because you introduce the Black Widow character in the film fairly prevalently. And you don't learn a lot about her other than the fact she's a super spy for Nick Fury and stuff like that. But that's really not all you need to know going into Avengers. You don't need to know a whole lot about her past. You learn about that later. And again, we'll learn about it more when her solo film comes out. But you introduce her. Nick Fury again plays a more prevalent role in this. And again, you'd see him come back again for Avengers in a main role. And then we move forward too, and we see all the different stuff that's going on with Tony Stark, and there's some Easter eggs in it. There's a Captain America shield Easter egg that's in there, and again, Captain America, the first Avenger, and Thor would both come out in 2011, leading up to Avengers in 2012. So it's just it does good at setting things up, and that's what you need, is to set things up for a big movie like that. But I don't necessarily know if you needed to have it to the point where it did damage to the plot, and I think it did in this film. because the plot line is kind of the tone. I shouldn't say the tone. The character development of Tony Stark is all over the place. From where you go, like he's mentally cracked and stuff like that. I think you could have gone a lot more serious with it. They tried to go a little bit more lighthearted, and it doesn't really work all that well. But those are just my personal feelings on how the plot works in this film. Like I said, it doesn't flow very well in certain scenes and away from certain things. The special effects are very good. As usual, I like Robert Downey Jr. His chemistry with Gwyneth Paltrow is very good. Um, Don Cheadle, I think, does a very good job in the movie, filling in, taking the role from Terrence Howard. Even though there's obviously a drastic physical difference between the two actors, I think he does a very good job at kind of just carrying on that role for the previous film. Uh, the movie is lacking in the villains department. Even though you have two villains, they're both very underdeveloped and they don't really feel all that menacing because they're basically, Justin Hammer is just a normal dude and he's kind of just a Weasley d-bag. And then Ivan Vanko is kind of he gets pretty much wiped even when he's winning, he gets wiped out within 2 minutes of Iron Man showing up in his armor. So overall, uh, you know, with this film, I'd have to give it a solid 4.5 repulsor explosions.
Drop it, Tony! Take it!
Out of 10. So with that, we're done with Iron Man 2, and then next time we will be moving into the first Thor film, which came out in 2011. Thank you again for watching. Remember, if you like these, leave a comment on the video. Hit the like button. Hit the bell for notifications. Subscribe, and remember, I live my life free of compromise. Do you?